You're listening to episode 111 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Our guest, Myoan Grace Schireson, speaks with us today about equality issues in her book, Zen Women, Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters. It's strange, don't you think, that in our 21st century culture, we still struggle with an imbalance in our attitudes towards people based on gender. How can this be? What are some of the problems we're seeing, and why do they continue to bedevil us? Tradition and cultural biases, let alone biology, seem to have a hand in prolonging our entrapment with viewing our friends, students, and teachers with gender-colored glasses, instead of seeing the tremendous potential of a student or admiring the skills of a competent teacher. We cloud that vision with reactions that the positive behaviors don't warrant. Our practice is, at least in part, about learning how to perceive more clearly and act in a skillful way. Yet we've seen that our biases take the lead, historically and in more recent events, regarding growing the Sangha by ordination of women as monastics. Abbess Myoan Grace Schireson is the founder and head teacher of the Empty Nest Zen Group, Modesto Valley Heartland Zen Group, and the Fresno River Zen Group. Grace is a Dharma heir in the lineage of Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, founder of the San Francisco Zen Center. Grace has practiced Zen meditation for more than 35 years and is author of the book Zen Women, Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters. In the United States, she has undergone her Soto Zen training with Sojun Mel Weitzman Roshi of Berkeley Zen Center, from whom she received Dharma transmission in 2005. Grace also is trained in the Rinzai Zen in Japan under Keido Fukushima Roshi, retired abbot of the Tofukoji Monastery located in Kyoto. She has taught classes on Zen throughout the United States and has also been trained as a clinical psychologist, teaching Asian methods of quieting the mind using techniques suitable for Westerners. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice gyokuro tea, which is Grace's favorite, so thank you, Grace, for this episode's recommendation. And our guest today is Grace Schireson. Grace, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for being interested in Zen women.
Oh, very, very glad to. It's something that I'm very passionate about, is this concept and what we need to do in practice of diversity, gender and ethnicity, and so many different ways, because that really opens up the practice to everyone. It's not just for one segment of society. So thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome, and I agree with you that it's not just for one segment. But by including the various voices, we get a much richer practice, and that was part of the reason I wanted to write the book.
Yeah, and the book itself, we'll get into that in a moment, and I think we're ready for that conversation, because there's some really interesting things that I want to find out about it and your perspective in writing it. But let's start with your background. Tell us about you as a Westerner and your engagement with Zen practice.
Well, I grew up in Los Angeles, actually in the San Fernando Valley, so for sure I'm a valley girl, you know. And I had some very strong feeling in my body whenever I attended any religious service, and I was very interested in that element, even though my life was going on a different path. And eventually I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and one of my sister's friends called and said, you know, there's a guy in San Francisco who can teach you how to get high without drugs. And that was Suzuki Roshi.
Mm-hmm.
And my sister and I said, oh, that sounds really cool. You know, she was about 22 and I was 20. And we both put on our psychedelic decorated motorcycle helmets and rode our motorcycles across the bridge to San Francisco Zen Center. We made an appointment for meditation instruction. And at that time, so it probably was 1966, the person who gave us meditation instruction at that hour was Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. So we walked in full tilt psychedelic outfits with boots from the Wizard of Oz and full mini skirts and the whole thing, and hair down to the floor practically, and all the decorations and earrings, and the psychedelic motorcycle helmets in hand. Now, when we walked in, we thought, of course, you know, we just look like ordinary citizens of our own style, but Suzuki Roshi saw us for who we were, which was fun seekers. So he made a mental note and took us in, and in his own very quiet and I would say weighty, there was something very serious about him. He was in his 60s at the time, and I was 20, and pretty much figured I knew it all, but I was willing to hear his spiel. And when he sat us down, he showed us that we bowed to the cushion, and then we bowed away from the cushion. And he said, you bow to the cushion to apologize to any of the spirits who may be sitting there already. Now, I've never heard this explanation at any other time or place since 45 years of practice. But I thought to myself in that moment, wow, how could this guy be so straight and be so far out at the same time? So he sat us down, and for what seemed like, a decade of meditation, or, at least 24 hours of meditation, I think it was 10 minutes, and we sat, and he taught us how to meditate. And then he said in very broken English to us, he put the hook in, is the way I describe it. He said, and then there were a lot of ums, and so I'll say it kind of like he did. The longer you do this practice, the more that you realize that life is suffering. Now, he knew we were fun seekers. And so he didn't say the more joy. He didn't make the sale. He didn't try to sell us on the practice. He didn't say, so when you do this practice, you'll come to very high states of consciousness and your life will be fulfilled. He said, and this was his way. He said, this was totally confounding. This is a kind of reverse psychology. The more you do this, the more you realize that life is suffering. And we couldn't get out of the building fast enough after And so this went on. We got on our motorcycles, drove home, and didn't think about meditation. And then one morning after I had had a great night of revelry in Berkeley, as only people, 20-year-olds in the 60s could do. And I said goodbye to my boyfriend, who was driving off in a psychedelic bus as he was running for mayor of Berkeley. I stood there on the sidewalk in my bare feet and looked across the street at the nursing home for the elderly, and just saw them sitting in the window watching me as I was watching them. And I said to myself, with my feet, I can still remember that feeling with my feet on that bare pavement there, oh, what he said was true. So that was maybe 2 months after I had been to see him. And I realized in that instant that just as an earthquake or a tsunami can change the course of a river, the course of my life had been changed in that realization. And so shortly after that, Eknath Eschwarn opened a meditation center right across the street from where I was standing. And so I said, oh, I see, I'm going to start meditating. And I began meditating quite regularly because it was very close and very possible. And then, I guess after 6 months to a year of meditating with Eschwarn's Blue Mountain Center, I realized that this motorcycle riding, miniskirt wearing young woman was not going to fit into this crowd of women who wore saris and dressed in the Indian style and were very reverential. It just wasn't going to work for me. And so I returned to Suzuki Roshi and began doing some all-day sittings with him and so on. But what was interesting to me about that experience is that, it was probably 30 or 28 years later when my sister on her 50th birthday said to me, do you remember that guy we met in San Francisco that time? And I knew without her saying any more than that who she meant. And I said, yes, I do remember him. She said, do you remember what he said to us? And I said, yes, I do. And she said to me, I think it's true.
I was just about to ask was if she had ever gone back.
She didn't go back. She didn't like meditation, but it's interesting how the experience of Dharma approaches and penetrates people in an entirely different way. And so it was almost 30 years later when she said to me, I think it was true what he said. And I had some people, having met Suzuki Roshi in that moment, would have known this is the course of my life. And for me, it took a couple of months for me to see my experience through what he had opened up. And someone else, it could take 30 years, 50 years, a whole lifetime, or as Buddhists sometimes like to say, many lifetimes, if that exists. So that was what her experience was. And it's very interesting to me that it works that way.
Now, in the intervening time, hadn't you two talked, especially based on the trajectory of your life during that time, you hadn't talked about the concept of life is suffering before this?
Well, I think we had talked about it, and in particular when she talked about her negative emotions, I said, well, because you have negative emotions about someone doesn't mean you indulge them. That's something to work on. It's just going to create more suffering. So we had talked about it in specifics, but I think we all learn in talking about spiritual practice with our family members that they're really not interested, and we don't need to proselytize, and that's really, I think, a strength that Buddhism has. It doesn't try to go out and convert. In fact, We know historically in Zen centers, when people would try to enter, they would actually discourage them by throwing slops at them and making them sit out on the cold. Because if you think your life is tough before you enter the practice, you begin to see that it's really worse than you thought when you begin to watch your own mind and the ways you create suffering. So he had at least spoken of suffering, but there's a special recognition, just like I remember that moment on the street when one sees, everything I've been trying to do is in vain. I will get old, I will age, I will get sick, I will die, and why don't I do what's important to me, and rather than distract myself from that fact? There's this very special turning there where the awareness opens to see, oh, I see. As Suzuki Roshi said, we all set out in a boat and we load it with all our favorite things. We go out in the water and it sinks, and it's our life. And so what is the meaning in during this time?
Yeah. I always try to prepare people who are just trying meditation for the first time that it's possible that a lot of thoughts are going to suddenly come up, and it's okay. They're there all the time. You haven't taken a look before. They're not something to be afraid of. They're something to engage with.
Yeah. Well, I do say that to people, but there's also something else I say. I usually reserve this statement for when people have made a bigger commitment and are coming to meditation retreats. I usually tell them, look, I didn't tell you this in the beginning because I didn't want to discourage you, but actually it's going to get a little worse for a while. And you're going to see that it isn't somebody else's fault. A lot of the time it's what you're doing, and that's kind of upsetting. So you have to understand we all have to cross that territory. At first, when people sit down, as when I first sat down and began a meditation practice, I had tremendous relief from the anxiety and depression I was suffering as a young woman. And so I felt a great deal of positive feelings. But not everybody has that. And I think people who do have that, I know Aya Kema describes it as sukha, that positive, pleasant feelings. Some of us get sukha and some of us get the dukkha, the painful experiences. But the people who have the sukha to begin with, that gives them some encouragement to stay on the path. But sooner or later, you have to cross over into the territory of understanding that this is your work and this is your mind. Deal with it.
Yeah, and you've made a couple of references just in the past few minutes about how these experiences are unique, that we don't all have the same things happen in the same order, in the same way when we start meditation. How do you deal sometimes with students who are expecting one thing and they get another?
Well, it took me a while to understand that my experience of falling in love with Zen was not the usual. So, I was totally flummoxed by people who would come and sit and never come back.
Yeah.
Or people who would come back for a little while, and then when the going got tough, they
got going.
Yeah, they got going. They voted with their feet. So I generally try to encourage people in the beginning that this is difficult. But basically what I found is just like Suzuki Roshi, who did not cater to my delusion that this should make me happier and make me high, he gave a paradoxical statement, which is this: you're going to get to know something about suffering by doing this. I feel that people who stick with practice need to do it because they need to do it, and that there's not that much I can say or do except to be available when they're having difficulties, to talk to them. And at those times I say this is part of the path, and just like the happy feelings, everything is impermanent. So are uncomfortable feelings. These are also impermanent. And these are some of the ways you can deal with it. And also I'll recommend, if they're having a great deal of suffering, that something is coming up that they haven't paid attention to before, and they may need to do therapy around it. So It depends on what their commitment is to practice, how long they've been coming, and what exactly the problem is. So I don't have any particular things that I say.
Mm-hmm. And that again, that you are being specific to the individual needs. It's situational. What do they want to get out of it? What is their commitment? What has their experience been? Is all very important. And one of the things that I really encourage people to find the right teacher for you. Having a teacher is very helpful to you in the practice.
Yes, it is. It's really an essential. And the fact is, that I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I can see some of the things that are troubling people, and until they actually give me permission and want to explore more deeply what their suffering is about, there's not so much to say. It is like in a therapeutic situation, it is, you can read a book about techniques of healing, but when you see a therapist, they work specifically with you and your ways of pushing aside your suffering or not handling it in a functional manner. So it's the same in practice. Everybody has different layers, and so it depends on what the layer is that's presenting. But I do try to make note, and my clinical skills are very helpful, of where a person feels unsafe and what they're protecting and what they're acting out. So that later, if they do make a commitment to practice, I will ask for their permission to say, is this something you're ready to talk about and go more deeply in? Because it's not just affecting you in your relationship with me and the practice, but also in other areas of your life. So that's one of my guidelines in working with people, is to ask their permission to go more deeply, rather than what I've seen in other Zen centers is the great Zen master sitting on high will make these pronouncements that reveal yourself or scold you in some. So I think it's very important to gain permission.
So let's talk for a moment now, taking a step onto your book, Zen Women, Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters. What was it that prompted you to write the book? Was there a single event or just a culmination of things that said, yes, this needs to be done?
Well, there certainly was a culmination, but there were many events that led to it. And I remember the first time, I noticed or had pointed out to me by another woman in the Sangha that I was attending, the Zen center I was attending. She said, why aren't there any female images on the altar? And I said, oh, that's interesting. There aren't. And wouldn't that be helpful? This was before I knew that there was such a thing as mirror neurons, which help us to relate and empathize with what's going on. And I had been making some trips to Japan and trying to explore the roots of the practice. So I found some images that I thought were more feminine, that looked like they had breasts on them, and brought them to be used at the Berkeley Zen Center. And then there was a sculptor there who made statues of Prajnaparamita in a very female form. So in the meantime, I put those images up. And then this was one of those things, what do they say, it's the 100th monkey, where one starts doing it and then we all start doing it. So this was a conversation that was emerging in various Zen centers, and one of the things that was also emerging was the chanting of the names of the early female ancestors from India. So there was a lot of interest in this. When I was traveling in Japan, and I found a teacher in Japan, so I made regular trips to Japan, and when I was traveling there, almost by accident, it's interesting how your life, your fate, just like that meeting with Suzuki Roshi, can sometimes just occur in kind of a spontaneous way. I made a trip to a temple in Nara Hokeji, which was founded by Empress Komyo very early on, and I heard they were playing a recording on that visit of the nuns chanting the Lotus Sutra in Japanese, and it was all women's voices. And sound, I had been to many Buddhist temples in Japan, and the sound of the women's voices was very penetrating to me. There was something about it. There was something about the flavor of the practice that was implied in the sound of these women chanting that I hadn't experienced in the traditional male-dominated practice that I had been doing. And so I became interested in just going to women's temples in Japan and learning something about the history of women. At the same time, for Mother's Day on the year, I think it was 2000 and maybe the year 2000, on Mother's Day, there was a meeting at San Francisco Zen Center for a celebration of female ancestors. And it was in May on Mother's Day. Usually that was a month that I would be in Japan practicing with my teacher because the weather was tolerable in the temple. So I would usually go in May and sometimes in November. But because my grandson had just been born in April, I had not gone to Japan that year. So it was very fortuitous that I attended this Mother's Day celebration of Zen's female ancestors. And at that meeting, there were a number of scholars, and I developed a particular affinity for the teachings of Miriam Levering, who is a professor of religious studies, and she's now living in Japan. And when I heard Miriam speak from her knowledge base, I went up to her after the presentation and said, I need to know everything you know about these women. And I don't know how to do that, but I had, because of my grandson, the birth of my grandson, I had retired pretty much from my clinical practice as a psychologist, and I was really devoting a lot of time both to my Zen practice and to spending time with this new baby, this grandson, my first grandson. So I said, I have time, and I can come to Knoxville, Tennessee, which is where she taught at the university, and I'll get a hotel room, and I want to come meet with you, and I want to go to your classes, and I want to know, I mean, she spoke Chinese and Japanese and read them both too, so there was a question about how far I was going to go with this. I want to know what you know. And so I began this relationship with Miriam Levering of visiting her and talking to her about these things. And as a Zen teacher, since I was a Zen teacher as well, she would invite me to her classes to teach at her classes on Zen. And little by little, we sort of collaborated in some of these conversations. And that's why I invited her to write the foreword for my book, because it was really meeting her and seeing what she embodied and how things had turned. The whole academic pursuit of Zen had been devoted to studying the great Zen masters. And the academic women who I've spoken to were all discouraged from studying the female ancestors. Their advisors told them, you know, you need to study the great male Zen masters. That's where the interest is, you know, and I don't know why you're wasting your time, you know, looking into these women who there's very little known about. So she was the one who inspired me to know that there was a possibility to know something about these women.
It's interesting that there seems to have been a perhaps even unconscious inclination on the part of the people telling you, oh, you know, study the male teachers, without even realizing that there's value in questioning patriarchy. There's value in questioning those standards that we have and going beyond them.
Yes. Well, yes. And even so, I had teachers tell me that my pursuit and interest in women was an ego-based interest in promoting myself. And I had to do my own internal check-in and say, is this so? Or is there something here that I need to know? Now, what happened after I had attended that meeting at San Francisco Zen Center, seeing how hungry women were for some scrap of a feminine voice in Zen teaching. That is what I had to say. Oh, I'm not the only one who wants to know this. There are many women who want to know this, who want to have this connection. And as you say, there is great value not only in questioning the patriarchy, but questioning any established story of the way it is, especially if you feel like you've been left out of the way it is, and that what you have to say or what those women had to say changes the whole story of Zen.
Yeah, questioning the narrative of privilege is so helpful to getting past boundaries that are constructs that aren't even there.
Well, the problem in the Buddhist tradition and in the Zen tradition is that questioning can sometimes be viewed as a negative quality. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes if people come to a group and say, well, why are you in charge? So even the questioning of, well, where are these women? How did this happen that, we thought we were the first women in the West to practice. And so that was part of the surprise in learning that there was a very rich history of women's practice. But they were always considered second-tier players, like today in the women's NBA. There's the NBA and there's the women's NBA. So it was the same in Zen. So the questioning can sometimes be perceived as, well, that's all about you trying to promote yourself as a woman and to be troublesome and rebellious, and we just need to accept it. And this is a very strong force in Buddhism, and just as it is in every religion and every established tradition. For example, even today in Thailand, where the women's order has died out and they have no official nuns order, when a Western teacher said, I will restart the women's order by ordaining nuns, I will get nuns from other traditions, we'll try to meet the requirements the Buddha had, the priest, the teacher in the Thai tradition, in the Thai Buddhist tradition who did this, was excommunicated by the conservative order of the Thai Buddhists.
Yeah, Ajahn Brahm, one of my favorite teachers.
Yeah, so we can see that Westerners come to Buddhism expecting, because of meditation and the teachings of the Buddha, that the institution will be beyond the usual conservative and traditional tendencies to self-protect and to keep the status quo and the privilege and entitlements. But it's not true. While the practice itself is enlightened and promises freedom, the institution can be very different.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I was so glad to see this book, because it was very clear that you were not only telling the story from an historical perspective, but tying it to the way that impacts contemporary practice settings. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but why don't you describe the structure of the book? There are 3 parts to it, and they each have a unique purpose. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, first of all, I want to say the overarching understanding I came to in trying to research and present this material was based on the need not to attack my tradition for having done this. So in order to come from a more positive voice, I said, okay, I can't say how awful they were to do this.
Right.
That's not going to be helpful right here. It's only going to make people feel more defensive, and it's going to trigger anger and wounds. So therefore, where I was coming from in writing the book was, who are these women and what did they do, and what does a practice sound like coming from them? So if these women speak, what does it sound like? So if we collect all the voices of these women, does it change the practice? Does it open up different notes in the song of Zen? So the structure that I came up with was first, I did write a PhD, so you have to review the literature before you start out on the new work.
Thank you.
So what I did was review the literature and say, okay, it's not like what I'm saying has never been said. Let me establish that there is ground. I'm not just being a troublemaker here. Here is the literature. Here is what has been said about women in Zen, and that is in our traditional curriculum, in which we have the Blue Cliff Record or the Gateless Gate. Some of the traditional teachings have women teachers in them, and this is what they say about them. So first I talked about how women appeared in the history of Buddhism and Zen. So I started out with women at the time of the Buddha and moved through China and Japan to some of the stories that showed up in the traditional literature. But then I said, well, that's very interesting because all of the, other than these Indian women who I'll talk about in a minute, that really, the Indian women in the history of Buddhism had their own voice, and it was called the Therigatha. But the women in China who showed up in the Zen tradition all sounded like men. And in fact, they were praised for being the same as men. In other words, there was a belief in Buddhism that you could not become enlightened in the body of a woman. But if you became enlightened, you no longer were a woman. Somehow you became a macho man. And so as Miriam Levering writes about this, the rhetoric of equality. In other words, they're equal because they're men.
Right. Yes, you have to be equal not based on how you are, but what we think you should be.
Right. So in our image.
Right.
We describe women who were as tough as nails, and undoubtedly they were. But the question is, was there anything else? How did they get there?
Yeah, what didn't make it into the histories?
Yeah, who trained them? Were they always tough as nails? Did they become more masculine based on their training? Were they really that way, or was this just one side? So I was very curious about that. So that's when I went on to study the next section of the book, which is women's Zen versus Zen's women's Zen. And that's where I started with the teachers of India and how much they talked about their bodies actually as part of their practice. Because a primary delusion for women is that their body and their beauty is their ticket to some privilege. And how much the women in the Indian tradition talked about their body, their use of sexual flirtation as a means to power, and how different that was from the awakening stories of the men. And then, so I went through then the history, and it was interesting to me because part of my gathering process took me to Korea. And the women's practice is actually thriving there, and there's an interesting reason why. But Koreans are not officially part of the Zen lineage that I have received. And in fact, the first practicing Buddhist nuns were nuns in Japan, and they were trained by Koreans. So actually, the first ordained Buddhists in Japan were women, and their lineage came from Korea. So not only were the women erased as the founders, as the first ordained Buddhists in Japan, but the Korean lineage was left out. Now that there are all kinds of political and perhaps other issues of why the Japanese have left the Koreans out of their lineage, but they talk about Zen coming from China, and it actually came over in terms of ordination from Korea. So I was very interested. I made a trip to Korea and went to a scholars conference on the history of women throughout Buddhism. So I got to learn a lot about the Korean women, and also I made a tour of some of the Korean convents and could see how strong they were. So I included the Korean women as well, and they had a certain quality in Korea of strength and fighting, because there were so many wars and everybody was in there conquering them, and independence. They had to stand on their own, and even when they did practice with a teacher, maybe they got to see the teacher some of the time, and then the teacher was off going to another temple. So they had a different quality. So I was very interested not only in the voice of what Zen sounded like from the women teachers, but I was also interested in the lives that they led prior to being ordained or to becoming teachers, and how they themselves as women had dealt with their family, whether they had children, and what their relationships with their disciples were, which were expressed in much more loving and affectionate terms than what you would see between the male masters, in my tradition anyway, this kind of samurai, very strong masculine sense of, we're all tough, and really talk about this element of affection and sadness when the teacher dies. So the other thing I became interested in were what were some of the historical events that made it possible for the women's lineage to continue. Because from the time of the Buddha in India, the most senior nun was considered junior to the most junior monk. It's not clear whether this was something that the Buddha established, or whether after his death the Sangha and the traditional meetings that they convened established this. But it was a fact, and because of this, the nuns often lacked funding and were not considered really equal to the teachings of the monks. The nuns' teachings were not equal to the teachings of the monks. So the lineage would often die out. But what I found were there were moments in history that were pivotal, and sometimes they were just accidents of history that strengthened the women's lineage. And one of these happened in China, where one of the emperors decided that it was against Confucian ideals for the women's lineage to be connected to the male lineage. So they should practice separately. And by empowering the women to practice separately, to ordain separately, and so on, and separating them, they developed their own strength. And that lineage is still continuing in China today. They have had a continuous lineage. In Korea, there was an accident of history that occurred around the time of the Second World War, after Japan had invaded Korea, where many of the Korean monks were converted to the Japanese style of Buddhism and married, whereas the women who were nuns in Korea did not marry. And when the Japanese were defeated and left Korea, there was a great deal of animosity towards the Korean monks, who were seen as collaborators by altering their practice and becoming married, as in the Japanese style. And so that style of married practice was looked down upon, and even the president, I think, of Korea said, all right, you're all out of the big monasteries. You've lost your place. Well, they did not have enough celibate monks to lead the large training monasteries in Korea when all of that changed. So they turned to the nuns, who had remained celibate throughout the war, and asked them to take over several of the large training institutions. So they received very large temples, and the traditional nature of their practice and the continuation of the traditional nature of the Korean practice brought them a lot of status and respect in Korea. So they are very well respected in Korea. And it's interesting, in Japan, the Zen tradition that I follow, the women there are not very many of them. And it's not clear to me what that's about, but it's not attracting the same numbers. And certainly they vote every year in Japan, just as the women had decided in Korea. They vote in Japan to maintain their celibate status, for example, in the Soto Zen sect, the sect I belong to, whereas the men are not celibate. And there are lots of reasons why the women's practice is different this way, because culturally, a woman who didn't put her husband first in Japan would really be looked down upon, and it would be really hard for her to run a temple as a married woman. So women have to sacrifice a lot to become nuns in Japan, and for whatever reason, they are not convinced that that sacrifice is not for them. So there are many aspects of the women's practice that's different, and that's what I found most interesting as I studied women's Zen, that the emphasis on relationship, the emphasis on finding oneself in context versus being the great master of the mountain who had transcended all earthly desires, women would talk about their practice and their humanity in a different voice.
So as you were researching this, did any of the historical figures become heroines to you?
Yes, I want to say that in particular, Rengetsu became a very important person to me, and she was one of the first nuns that, it was one of those little events that put me on the path of this research. And I want to say something more about her, and specifically her way of talking about the Dharma. This was a woman who was adopted, who lost both of her parents, and was adopted at a very early age by a Buddhist priest, and had several marriages, or at least two, that ended either with death or separation, one of which may have been abusive, who had at least 3 children, maybe 4, who all died in infancy. And at the point where she was establishing her practice under the protection of her adoptive father, he died, and she was then left with no place to live. They wouldn't allow her to stay in the Buddhist temple. So this was a woman, there's a blues song, if it weren't for bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all.
Yeah.
This is a woman who had faced all the kinds of conventional suffering that women face, not only then, but throughout history, and had transformed her suffering into a practice that expressed how she worked with her suffering. And also she created more than 50,000 pieces of art. So when she was forced to leave the temple, she decided, well, she had been trained to play Go, which Go is to chess as chess is to checkers. It's a very complex game. And she said, I could teach men how to play Go, but they won't like having me beat them. So that won't. So what other skills do I have? I know I could write poetry and I can make teacups. So she decided to gather clay. She would gather clay with her own hands and inscribe her poems, which are essentially Zen poems, on these cups and on these scrolls. And she became very popular even in her lifetime, and it still remains one of the most successful female artists in history. And the reason I am so attracted to her teaching is the way she talks about her Dharma with a kind of sadness and exposing herself. For example, the first thing that I saw from her was called the Crimson Colors of Autumn, and she wrote, I should have no attachment to the sights and sounds and smells of this world, but how do I keep my vows gazing at today's crimson maple leaves? And this sense of being human and having longings and having vows and how they meet in a human being is exposed in the women's practice in a way that it is not so exposed. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. Hakuin Zenji and Ryokan both talk in a very human voice.
They're some of our favorite poets.
Yeah, and Ikkyu as well. But it generally, what you hear from them, from the male teachings, is how they have transcended all these longings. How do I keep my vows when I'm walking by the shoe sale at Nordstrom's? This is a very important question. How do we live our lives in this culture and not be owned by our longings, but also not turn ourselves into some clone of what we think we should be? So maintaining our humanity is a very important aspect of the women's teaching.
That's one of the key things that I think has been a gap in the way many traditions have presented their goals, is that transcendence rather than engagement. And I think what you're referring to, it seems to be, is that this is something that perhaps is a positive acknowledgement of our normal human feelings and passions, that we don't have to engage with them and let them run the show, but not necessarily deny them.
Right. We can't, this is the term that John Wellwood coined, spiritual bypassing. But what the form I see it take in many Zen practice places is that people begin to understand the values of the Zen culture and start imitating them. And so you have people walking around in a very stiff position with eyes cast down, not making eye contact, not smiling. And of course, anger is very forbidden, so conflict can simmer for years without anybody talking about anything, although it's wreaking havoc in the communities. So there are many problems that come from people doing what Suzuki Roshi called trying to look like good. We're trying to look good at the practice and not letting it really engage with our lives. And so, I think that's very important. The other thing about engagement is that Western Buddhists had the idea that engaged Buddhism was something that we invented. And when you look back at the history of the women, because they depended on the community so much for support, they didn't have the support perhaps of the kings and the emperors. They were always engaged with the community, or perhaps because of who they were as women. They had previously taken care of family members. This is a bigger part, perhaps, this relational aspect of being a female. They were always engaged with the community in projects, whether it was washing people with Hansen's disease, people who had leprosy, or whether it was creating schools for children or soup kitchens. They were always. Now, it's not that this was absent from the male Zen tradition, but it was not the same consistent story for the male tradition. The male tradition, just becoming enlightened was the way you saved all beings. For women, actually putting your hands on another being and helping them in this lifetime, that was the way you maintained your bodhisattva vow of saving all beings.
Yeah, and I will confess that resonates a bit more with my own practice, is what are we doing in this lifetime? Yes.
Well, that's become a big part of Western Buddhism, and I think it's very important because when I've heard other people criticize our tradition, they say, well, it's all very nice, you sit in your monasteries and you go to these high states, but what are you doing to help the world? All the Christian traditions and the Jewish faith, they all have their projects to help others.
Well, let's take that opportunity to talk a bit about our contemporary Western practitioners. Let's talk about the Western women for a moment. Whom do you admire, and what is it about them that you admire so much?
I admire all women who have taken on Buddhism, because I know that, and taken it on to the level of being a teacher, I know how many obstacles they have encountered. So Tenzin Palmo and Sultra Malioni in the Tibetan tradition, and Christina Feldman in the Theravadan, in the Spirit Rock tradition, and Sylvia Boorstein. And in my own tradition, Joko Beck and Tony Packer were real pioneers, Blanche Hartman, and Darlene Cohen. Now, I want to say some more about Darlene Cohen, who was a very close friend of mine and who I admired so much because she did what Rengetsu did. It's one thing if you're physically able and suited to be a monk, and it's another thing if you have a rheumatoid arthritis and you can't even get up the steps of the Zen Center to practice, but you find a way to do it and to help other people who are injured to do practice. Because all of us, no matter whether our joints are stellar and we look like a yogi when we get into a zazen posture, or whether we have to meditate lying down, we all have an ability to access this depth of awareness, and the point is we need to be able to find our way to do that, and this was something Darlene did. So I admire the women who came forward in their traditions because I know how many obstacles they faced in trying to do that, and I also admire that they founded places and continued teaching despite all these obstacles. Another one is Ayakema in the Theravadan tradition. So any of the women who began to practice faced all these obstacles and said, there's something deeper here. There's something that does transcend gender here, and I am going to have to practice all the harder. I had a discussion with my own teacher about this and the prejudice against women. And he said, well, women need to find their, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said, women need to find their freedom despite all these things, despite all these obstacles and prejudices. And my response to him, I do know that that's true. My response to him was, well, I think we're very good at doing that, taking on our larger share of these obstacles of practice, being excluded and not treated with equal respect. I think we're very good at that and continuing to practice. But I think these are significant advantages in a certain way. And any woman who survived in the tradition actually, to me, represents a deeper level of awakening.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because they've had these obstacles. So I said, I think these obstacles that women have used to practice have been a significant advantage. And I think it's unfair that we as women have had these advantages when men could be just as equally benefiting from having these kinds of obstacles. It's not fair for us to gather all the benefits from being stereotyped and have prejudice against us. Men should have some of that too. Well, I'm saying that with humor, but in a certain sense, this idea that, well, it's all part of practice, that's true. But the fact is, men would also benefit if women were put in positions and they felt that they may not be given the same level of equality, that would be an interesting juxtaposition for them to work with.
Well, that is actually a good segue to one of the final questions that I have for you is, what would you like to see done differently with the roles women have in our contemporary practice settings? What is it we can learn from the past that can contribute to how we engage now?
Well, one of the things that I'm really focusing on now is the negative stereotyping for women in authority, and making people conscious that when a woman is in an authoritative position, unless she leads with a traditional female nurturing quality, it's very hard for people to accept her leadership. And even then, she is not seen as equal to the sort of stoic, strong, silent male type. So I would like to see us consciously explore within Buddhist communities, what does a female leader look like? I think we saw some of this negative stereotyping when Hillary Clinton had her presidential campaign. People accused her of being ambitious. Well, of course
Of course. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, having ambitions to be president, of course it's ambitious. It's acceptable in men. It's not acceptable in women. So there are images of male leadership, strong, silent, cooperative. But what is the image? What does a female leader look like? And how do we recognize that it's different? They may be more talkative. They may not look so strong. They may not be the strong, silent type. And they may have a more engaged style. They may not look like traditional Zen masters. So I think that understanding some of the traditional stereotypes that men have, or that our society has, that women have, I think that's one of the most painful things for me. And it would be a second ambition I would have for the Zen community, is that women talk about their own negative behaviors towards other women. Feminists talk about the crab pot effect, where a woman in power is seen as a threat, and other women are the crabs in the pot trying to pull her down from her position of power. There's something in men that knows that building a team and having a general and a lieutenant and a captain all makes sense, but there's something in women's behavior that doesn't support their female leadership. So that's something I'd like to see as a discussion. So for me, it's about educating the community into some of these really stubborn dynamics. One has to do with female leadership. One has to do with what it is that's going on unconsciously in the competition between females and the dislike of women towards each other. And the third thing is about how women ingratiate as a way to seek power in community. They ingratiate in seeking approval. They don't feel they can stand up and be themselves and take on the jobs. And it's very interesting to me to talk to Zen teachers, and I would say, so-and-so, Pamela is your senior priest. Why did you make Tom the head priest before Pamela? And the male teacher would say to me, well, that's because Pamela doesn't like to give talks. But Tom likes to give talks. I said, that's right. That's the female delusion, stepping into a position where one might be criticized. So instead, women like to stay in the background and ingratiate and make sure people like them, and they don't want to put that at risk. And that also leads into maybe a fourth point, which is women seeking power through this ingratiation and through sexual relationships with men in power, which is a disastrous practice within the Zen communities and Buddhist communities.
Yeah, and we've seen that in many instances, unfortunately, in recent history, of just how damaging that can be when people may abuse those kinds of relationships or their assertions of authority over others instead of doing what is best for the community and for each other.
Right, and particularly for the students. I try to educate male teachers and female teachers that a male comes into a Zen community with a sense usually of his own competence and wanting to be the top, get to the top. And all the practices in Zen are for teaching men how to belong to the community and how to bow down to authority. Well, women already know how to do that. Mm-hmm. And they tend to do it too much and not step up. So the idea of Zen practice is to help men discover their more vulnerable side and help women uncover their more powerful side. We need to, as teachers, work on the specific delusions, and the practices that are being done now in the West came not from the convents and monasteries, but came strictly from the monasteries. The teachers who came over had never practiced with female practitioners side by side, and they had not taught female students. So some of the methodology needs to be adjusted to address specifically what the female delusions are. And I talk about that methodology in my book about meeting women where they are and making use of their strengths and building their confidence rather than allowing them to ingratiate and stay in the shadows.
Well, we have been speaking about the book Zen Women, Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters with our guest today, Grace Schireson. Grace, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate your time today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for your interest and for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.